let's continue. So far we've been talking about social cognition in adult, intact, neurologically intact, not mentally ill human organisms, and a little bit about how social cognitive processes relate to what's going on in the brain. What I want to do today is to begin a discussion about where social cognition comes from, which is to say how it develops. And to begin with, let me just say that there are a couple of, this has to be this loud for, yeah. There are a couple of different ways to think about development. The usual way we think about development in psychology and most places in cognitive science is what you might call the ontogenetic view of development. And here we're concerned with the development of some characteristic or feature across the lifespan of the individual organism from birth to death. This is the usual way that developmental psychology is taught, that development is approached in psychology and cognitive science, and it's the kind of thing that gets caught up in arguments about nature and nurture and all of that, about which I'll have more to say in a second. The second view, which is a little bit less common but no less interesting, is what you might call the phylogenetic view of development, which isn't interested in the development of some mental process in some individual person, infant, child, adult, college student, whatever, but rather is interested in the development of that characteristic across the course of evolutionary time. And what you get in these kinds of studies essentially are cross-species comparisons, and a particular species comparison that's particularly popular is a comparison between human children and chimpanzees. The idea that we've got about 98.5% genetic overlap with chimpanzees, we humans do. They're our closest living non-human relative. And so it's of interest to compare what humans can do to what chimpanzees can do, and especially what human children can do to what chimpanzees can do. The third aspect of development, which gets hardly any attention at all in psychology and cognitive science, at least until very recently, is the cultural view of development, which tries to trace the relations between the development of some mental process or some mental characteristic in the individual and the development of the society or the culture in which he or she is part. This has its roots in 19th century cognitive anthropology, where especially European empire builders were particularly interested in studying the mental states of the people that they built their empires on. So there are a lot of comparisons between so-called primitive and so-called advanced minds. Under the influence of Marxist theory, a number of psychologists and anthropologists have studied the effects of things like economic and social and political development on human thinking. The idea that literacy changes how people think, and so also might change how people think about society, and also that various aspects of political and economic development might change how people think, especially how they think about society. We're going to focus on the ontogenetic view in these lectures, though I hope to have time on Wednesday to say a little something about the phylogenetic view, which is a very interesting area of research right now. But the basic question that we're asking from the ontogenetic view is, what's the difference between the mind of a child and the mind of an adult? And in this course, what we're particularly interested in are age differences, child-adult differences in various aspects of social cognition. Now, there are two broad themes. I'm not a developmental psychologist, but looking at developmental psychologists and having known a lot of developmental psychologists, it seems to me that there are two broad themes in the ontogenetic view of development that we ought to talk about for a minute, just to kind of lay the foundations for what we're going to do next. The first is, if you're going to ask the question about what's the difference between the mind of a child and the mind of an adult, how does the mind change over the lifespan of the individual, there's a difference between focusing on quantitative changes, that is, changes that occur across a continuum, kind of a smooth continuum of change, versus qualitative changes. As an example of the quantitative view is the old view of the British empiricists of the infant mind as a tabula rasa, as a blank slate that is written on by experience. So you kind of get the idea that the child comes into the world fresh out of the womb knowing nothing, and then begins to have experiences which have somehow inscribed themselves on the mind of the child, and that the more the child piles up various kinds of experiences and memories and opportunities to learn, the more developed the child gets. But it's essentially a continuous view of development. That is, that the child is engaged in a continuous process of acquiring knowledge through experience. The competing view is the idea that there are qualitative differences between the mind of a child and the mind of an adult. That's a view that is epitomized in a quotation from Jerome Kagan, that babies are a lot smarter than we think they are. They're not tabula rasas that are simply written on by experience, but that they come into the world endowed with particular kinds of cognitive abilities, but these cognitive abilities undergo a certain kind of change over the course of life. And again, there's a focus especially on discontinuities, that children have a lot of cognitive abilities, it's just that their cognitive abilities are qualitatively different from those of adults. This is a view that's famously associated with the work of the Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, about whom I'll have more to say in a couple of minutes. Okay, so whether development is to be characterized in terms of smooth quantitative shifts, or more abrupt qualitative shifts, is one theme that we see in the ontogenetic view of development. The other one is in terms of kind of where development is going, or where development, the nature of development, what's being developed. And here, I think we can see developmental psychology, developmental cognitive science as shifting back and forth again between two views, not so much quantitative versus qualitative aspects of development, but rather whether the research focuses on what might be called the cognitive starting point for development, that is, where the infant fresh out of the womb starts out, and the cognitive endpoint for development, that is, what it's like when development has, for all intents and purposes, stopped. Again, the focus on the cognitive starting point is epitomized by the debate over between nature and nurture, the debate about whether the child comes into the world already equipped with certain mental abilities or certain mental faculties, or whether these have to be acquired from scratch as a result of experience. So again, the cognitive research that focuses on the cognitive starting point asks kind of, when does development start? Does it start at birth, or has some kind of development already taken place at the time that the child is born? The other research focuses on what you might be called a cognitive endpoint, or what you might think of as a teleological view of development. Where's the whole process? Where's the whole process heading? Where's it going? I'm going to give you examples of both of these kinds of things in a minute. In fact, I'll do it right now. Here is a really good example of a focus on the teleological, focus on the cognitive starting point in a question about preference for faces. We know, even if there isn't a fusiform face area that's dedicated to the perception of faces, we know that face perception is a fundamental aspect of social cognition. It's something that the children do. And the question is, when do they do it? Do children learn to pay attention to faces, or do they come into the world already equipped with some kind of more or less primitive cognitive schema that leads them to pay attention to faces because they, in some sense, already know how to do that? This is the kind of question that's addressed in research by Johnson and colleagues on newborn preference for faces. Again, I'm not taking a position on this. I don't actually care what the answer is, but there's a really good example of research that focused on the cognitive starting point, addressing questions of nativism versus empiricism. What does the child bring with it into the world? What does the child acquire through its experience of the world? Well, what Johnson and his colleagues did was to present pretty much newborn infants. These are fresh out of the womb. They're 37 minutes old on average, which is pretty young if you think about it, with faces or with stimuli like these that they basically moved in front of the child. Basically give the neonate opportunity to open its eyes, kind of clean the puck out of it, and then you hold these stimuli in front of it, and you look to see if the child actually watches the stimulus, and you measure the watching behavior either in terms of whether the child moves his eyes to follow the moving object or whether the child moves his head to follow the moving object. And again, these were the stimuli that were presented. Here is a schematic face with eyes and eyebrows and nose and mouth. Here is a scrambled face with exactly the same physical features, just not arranged in a face-like arrangement, and then there's an object that's just blank. And the result of the study is that the kids 37 minutes out of the womb actually have a preference for their normal face. Whether you look at turns of the eyes or turns of the head, they are much more likely to follow a normal facial configuration than they are the scrambled facial configuration. They're interested in them both compared to a blank stimulus, but they're much more interested in the normal face than in the scrambled face. Here's another example of this. This is the second experiment using a somewhat more interesting array of stimuli. Here's our face stimulus again. Here's the same configuration as the face stimulus, but it doesn't look like a face anymore. These are just squares. Yeah, we can kind of see them as eyes and a mouth, but it's not nearly as eye-y or mouthy as this one. Here you have the eye, nose, and mouth the features arranged in a row, and here you have the same configuration except inverted. And when you pass these things in front of the eyes of pretty much newborn infants, you get pretty much the same kind of results. The children, the infants, are much more interested in the normal configuration, the normal face stimulus, than in the configural or any of the other options. Okay, so what that tells us is that, as far as we can tell, as soon as the child opens its eyes, it's got a preference for faces. Okay, so as close as we can tell, the starting point is that the child comes into the world with something like an innate visual preference for face-like stimuli. There's something about the face that the child is built to pay attention to, as much as we can know. Now you could say, well, 37 minutes is a long time. Well, it's not very long, right? It's a pretty good guess that there's some kind of innate schema, innate cognitive schema that leads the child to be particularly interested in these kinds of faces. Okay, so that's a good example of research, social cognitive research, that focuses on the cognitive starting point, whether some feature of social cognition is innate or acquired through learning. The research on the cognitive endpoint is, I think, epitomized by the whole line of developmental research, very famous line of developmental research that was initiated by Jean Piaget in the 30s, and that became famous in the 50s and 60s when the Piagetian viewpoint began to be taken up by American and other European psychologists. To make a long story short, you're not going to get a lot of developmental psychology from me. You'll get enough of that from Andrea and Kevin. One way of thinking about Piaget's theory is that it's kind of a fusion of nativism and empiricism. Piaget agreed that the child brings with it into the world some innate cognitive structures. Piaget called them schemata, but also argued that those schemata become refined and developed as the child has actual experience in the world. Piaget's own analogy was to the process by which a genotype that develops into a phenotype. Yeah, there's a genotype which is not completely accurately thought of as a genetic blueprint, but that the organism's genotype interacts with the environment to produce what the organism actually looks like and does, and all of that business. And Piaget had very much the same kind of idea. He argued that the child comes into the world with a set of innate cognitive, with some kind of innate cognitive endowment. Piaget called them a very primitive cognitive schemata, and that a kind of dialogue ensues between the child and the world, in which the child first assimilates stimuli in the environment to whatever schema is prevailing at the time, and in the second aspect of the dialogue accommodates or changes its cognitive schema so that the world fits in better. So there are some primitive cognitive schemata that are innate, and then they're fleshed out and developed and changed in various ways as the child actually interacts with the world. But from Piaget's point of view, development is headed someplace, and where development is headed to is a stage of a kind of cognition which Piaget characterized as formal operations, basically entailing logic and stuff like that. But the general idea was that child comes into the world with sensory motor schemata, very primitive sensory motor schemata, and then through interaction with the world passes through a couple of other qualitatively distinct stages: a pre-operational period, the period of concrete operations. All of you know like this, I think, from your other coursework. But that development produces what you would think of as the final accomplishment of cognitive development, which is that the child, somewhere around the preteen years, teenage years, early teenage years, around age 12 or so, gets the ability to deal with abstract concepts and the capacity to apply something like formal logic. This is what formal operations is all about, and that's the teleological goal of development from Piaget's view. Here's another view of this, where the child starts out with sensory motor intelligence and then moves into what's known as the pre-operational period, and the shift from one stage to another is associated with a set of cognitive landmarks. So, for example, the acquisition of object permanence, the ability to hold a mental representation of a stimulus in your head, even when a stimulus has disappeared from the environment, that marks the child's transition from the sensory motor period to the pre-operational period. Similarly, the acquisition of the ability to conserve marks the child's transition from the pre-operational period to concrete operations, and the ability of the child to engage in abstract logical thought marks the child's movement from the period of concrete operations into the period of formal operations. Now, that's all the Piaget you're going to get from me, except that while Piaget measured the child's progress through these stages, usually in terms of non-social kinds of the tests. There was one aspect of Piaget's theory, an aspect of marking the transition between the pre-operational period and the period of concrete operations, which involved an explicitly social cognitive function, and this is what Piaget referred to as the loss of egocentricity. Now, in Piaget's theory, egocentricity doesn't mean what it means in ordinary language. If you've gotten this far in psychology and cognitive science, you know that none of these technical terms mean what they mean in ordinary language. Egocentricity doesn't mean that the child is only concerned about himself. Not really. In Piaget's terms, egocentricity really has to do with the child's beliefs about the relationship between what he or she thinks and feels and wants and does, and what other people would think and feel and want and do. So the loss of egocentrism can be thought of as a cognitive milestone in the development of social cognition, because what happens is that the egocentric child believes that other people experience the world the way he or she does. When the child loses egocentricity in this transition between the pre-operational period and the period of concrete operations, the child figures out or gets that other people's experience of the world, what they think, what they perceive, what they believe, and so on, might very well be different from what he or she wants. This is was measured by the egocentricity was measured by Piaget and his colleague Barbel Inhelder in terms of what's known as the point of view task. Here's the point of view task. It's also sometimes known as the three mountains task, and it's sometimes known as the Sally Ann task, because it involves two creatures. A real little girl here, call her Sally, and a doll up there, call her Anne. And they're positioned at on opposite sides of a two-dimensional display, which consists of a couple of mountains, one of which is topped by a cross, the other which is topped by a snowcap, a little hill there, and you can see a cabin or a chapel or something like that on the hill. And the basic idea behind the three mountains task is to ask Sally, whether Anne can see what she sees. So you ask Sally, can Anne see the cross? And Sally says yes. Okay, it's very clear that Anne can see the cross. And then you ask Sally, can Anne see the chapel? And the question is, will Sally believe that Anne can see the chapel, even though from Anne's point of view, the view of the chapel is obscured by this hill? Okay, that's the whole idea. And Piaget's own research on this was a little fuzzy. What was it? Two subjects, both his kids. Okay, but somebody actually did the study right. Piaget's another one of these guys is a brilliant thinker, but not the best experimenter in the world. Sometimes it almost seems like you have to make a choice. The people who have the really most interesting ideas in psychology usually do the worst experiments, and the people who do the best, cleanest, most elegant experiments so often have unbelievably boring ideas. But anyway, here's what happens when you do it right. Brzezinski tested children aged 4, 6, 8, and 10, and you can see here that 4-year-olds tend to make egocentric responses. Sally believes that Anne will see what she sees, and as the children age, they overwhelmingly come to make the correct responses, which represents the fact that somehow they know that the other person's experience is different from their own experience. That's what we mean by the loss of egocentrism, marking the shift between the pre-operational period and the period of concrete operations. And it's a social cognitive task, because what Sally has to do is to have some understanding of what's going on in some other person's mind. More recently, social cognitive developmental psychology has focused on the acquisition, an elaboration of this idea of egocentrism. Social cognitive developmental psychology has focused on the child's acquisition of what we call the theory of mind. The theory of mind that comes basically in two parts. The first, the idea that we have mental states, that we have mental representations of the world outside, and that our mental states are ours, that they belong to us in some way. And going along with that is the idea that other people have mental states like we do. But as the theory of mind develops, people have the appreciation that I've got mental states, you've got mental states like I do, but the content of your mental states may be quite different from mine. Theory of mind is also sometimes referred to as metacognition, which has to do with our knowledge of the contents of our own minds, and also our knowledge about the principles by which our minds work. Again, that kind of knowledge doesn't make any sense unless you understand that you actually have a mind, that you're actually thinking and remembering and perceiving kinds of things. And then all of this extending to the knowledge of other minds as well, that other people have mental states too, and that we can infer these things infer the contents of their minds from their behavior and other aspects of their condition in the situation. Now, just in passing, I'm not going to talk about this much. The idea of a theory of mind is itself embedded in a new approach to cognitive development, really kind of formulated by Berkeley's own Alison Gopnik and some of her colleagues, which it gets called the theory of development, or better yet, the theory of development, because the theory of development basically says that, yes, the child acquires a theory of mind as it develops, and that's what interests us in this course, but the theory of mind is only one of a number of theories that the child is acquiring over development. The theory people, the theoreticians, pick up on Piaget's idea that the child is kind of a naive scientist, trying to make sense of the world, and this sense that the child has of the world is represented in a set of theories that the child induces from experience and then tests and refines by making predictions about what's going to happen under various kinds of circumstances. So whereas the theory of mind represents the child's theory about how his or her own mind works, or about how minds work in general, there's a naive physical theory, which is the child's idea about how the physical world works. There's a naive biology, the child's developing theory about how the biological world works. And although they don't talk about it too much, there's a naive psychology.